Our story today is about adventure. And any of you who know about racing know that anytime you get into a race car, it's a feeling of adventure. But think of a kind of race car that doesn't have rules, that you can do anything you want to do. That was the Can-Am series. As long as it had a second seat that you could call a seat and cram somebody like me in, and if it had fenders so that the S68 could say it was a sports car, then you could do anything you wanted. You could put as big an engine in it as you wanted. You could put 2 engines in it if you wanted. There was a Can-Am car with 4 engines at once. No limit on the size of the tires, the materials, the aerodynamics. Anything was possible, which made it such an adventure. I used to remember driving across the country from race to race, thinking, I really don't know what we're going to see at the next racetrack. And almost every time there was something brand new, including in 1970 at Motorsports, that red wedge, the tiny tire car. Don calls it the knee-high car because that's literally as high as it was. You stood next to it, it came to your kneecap, even for a short person like me. And we have the guys here who designed that, who created it, and the intrepid guy who drove it for its first 2 races. Who could that And that car was not a brilliant success, although it was by no means a slow car. It was a competitive car in terms of speed, especially straightaway speed. But 4 years later, with the DN4 Shadow, they ended up winning the championship. So we have the beginning and the end of the Shadow story here, and 3 of the guys who were involved in the beginning. And I spoke about adventure, and let me talk about Mr. Nichols here. We think of Don as the guy who had the ability and the vision to let Trevor create the wild idea that he had. Trevor has a lot of wild ideas. But I also want to mention that before Don got into motor racing, Don has told me he left school early because he was afraid he would miss World War II. He went into the Army, he qualified as a paratrooper, as a member of the elite Pathfinders unit, which meant that before dawn, on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, he jumped out of an airplane 15 miles behind German lines at Normandy, where he sustained injuries. And then, Don, you were taken back to the beach where you woke up in a tent, and an artillery shell landed there, and he was wounded again. And then after he recovered, he participated in battles in Holland and in the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium. So we have an adventurous man here who is a hero of World War II. I just want you to know the kind of man that later on created these cars. And I have now talked enough, but let's talk about Don coming back to America after having had a rather mysterious career in military counterintelligence in the Far East. And he fell in with Trevor, and they decided that it would be an interesting idea to enter the Can-Am with a 2-dimensional car with very, very low frontal area so that it will go fast. So why don't both of you together start talking about that project and particularly how you came up with the name Shadow?
Hello? Hello? Trevor? I think you should do most of the talking. You had the idea that if money was available, which happened to have some, that you could do a car that would sort of set new standards of performance and primarily based on its dimensions. So I couldn't resist the challenge, so I found the money, and Trevor launched the Shadow career.
In 1968, shop of my own testing. 1, 2, 3. We've got only partial operation here.
It's okay.
1968. I had a small shop in Costa Mesa, and I was building miscellaneous components for race cars for people. I had done work with Can-Am cars certainly prior to that. But anyway, I had a small shop, and Don, I had met previously, courtesy of a dinner with Charlie Hayes, long before that. And you know, I can do this without without this. Anyway, so I met Don, and Don had a Lola that he needed a 427. A big.
Trade mics. There you go. Send that sucker home.
Testing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Anyway, Don had a Lola car that needed an engine put into it, and I agreed to do this for him, and it was brought down to my little shop, and I did it for him. And while he was at the shop, I, for some reason or another, I chanced to show him a little project that I was working on, namely an extremely small potential Can-Am car that, in my mind at that time, was to have a Corvair engine in it. And Don, typical Don, thought about what I'd said and wondered if there was any potential for putting a larger than turbocharged Corvair engine in it, to which I replied, well, certainly we could do a small car that might indeed have a Chevrolet engine in it, and which was certainly more in keeping with the engines of the times and the power of the times. So Don got really interested in the idea, and I showed him some sketches of what I had in mind, which actually looked a bit different from the car you see there, because the original car actually didn't have a wing on it. So the car was extremely low, and the exhaust system couldn't be seen. And unfortunately, we don't have a picture right here, but there are some pictures in books around here of the original car. And anyway, I set about making a cardboard and wooden mock-up that I could sit in, and Don could sit in and get pictures of it. And the mock-up had cardboard and wooden tires on it, and very small, about a 15-inch diameter front tire and about an 18-inch diameter rear tire, and a Chevrolet engine mounted behind the driver as low as I could get it. And what we ended up with was a mock-up that you could take a picture of and send to somebody and actually use for promotional purposes, which we ultimately did. Anyway, the original car was so small that it required tires for it. For the project to have existed, the first thing that happened was that we needed to find out and figure out somebody that might be fool enough to build a very small tire that would fit only our car. And Don and I set up a meeting with the Firestone race car department, and Don had a good familiarity with Firestone tires because he was the Firestone racing tire distributor in Japan at that time, as I recall. And I'd done a lot of work with Firestone, with George Follmer running his T70 back in 1967. It ran out of a shop that I and my ex-partner Bruce Burness had. So George did a terrific job running his T70, and it was always on Firestone tires. So Don and I, and this is a long answer to a simple question, and it could be too long, but anyway, Don and I set up a meeting with Firestone's race car department, and I'd done a group of pictures and graphs of what a car might do if it could do what I thought it could do. Some of the things that I thought it could do never actually happened, but anyway, we set about going to Firestone. We made a presentation to them. They never they never built a tire for somebody that had no applications in other, with any other teams. And so Don and I figured that the odds of them agreeing to such a thing were probably pretty close to zero, but it was certainly worth trying. So by the end of the meeting, the head of their racing tire department, a guy named Harry Davis at that time, he stood up, and the group of engineers that were in the room, they were all eager for it, and Harry said, we'll do it. And this is at the end of day one promotion. And Don and I were the most amazed guys in the room at that point in time. Not only amazed, but terrified. Because now, if they agreed to build the tires, guess what? We had to build a car. And guess who had to fund it? The guy that probably didn't really have the funds to do such a thing, and that was Don. But through the years, I felt Don Nichols was the kind of guy that if you wanted to do something, if Don wants to do something, it's going to happen one way or another. And that's the way the project started. Don agreed to fund the construction of the car. Yes, he agreed to fund the construction of the car. And if we built the car, Firestone said they built the tires. And of course, it was a grand experiment for everybody, and this is the thing that's lost in history, and that is that Firestone said that they'd never done such a tire, but they certainly thought it would be an interesting project. Testing 1, 2, 3, yeah. They thought it would be an interesting endeavor, and they would like to explore the limits of tire design. Plus, unbeknownst to the public at that time, the tire that we presented to them that we wanted to make was very similar to a tire that they'd done for Oldsmobile, for a Tornado that nobody ever heard about also of that era. Apparently Oldsmobile was looking at doing a car with a tire that was completely under the bodywork. And to do that required a very small diameter wide tire. And so our tires dovetailed directly with the direction that Firestone thought tire development might go in. And that's probably the only reason they agreed to do such a crazy thing. So they committed on a document to doing this thing. Now, going into this thing, they said that they had no idea if this small tire was going to work or not, but they certainly would give their best in the project, and they hoped we'd come up with they would come up with a successful tire. And the way we approached the project is we said that we, didn't know where it all was going to go, but we would certainly do our best to produce the best car we could within that design envelope, which was, even at this point in time, it's a fascinating design envelope, lots of flaws to it, and retrospect is a great tool at this point in time. But still, it was a great project, and we set about building the car, and Firestone set about building the tires.
Which one of you came up with the name Shadow and why?
Well, Don and I vied for naming the Shadow, and now I recall naming it the Shadow because I thought the Shadow was the only thing that might have some hope in hell of being faster than the speed of light. So that's where that was my end of the Shadow name. Don has a completely different take, and I actually think he's correct also on his take of Shadow. Do you recall, Don, do you recall your input on the Shadow name?
Yes, my recollection is, and it's fairly clear, that we envisaged building a very, very low-profile car for the simple reason, closer, for the simple reason, hello?
Back where you had it.
Yeah.
This way?
Further away, I guess.
Further away. Okay, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Realizing a physical shape passing through the air, of course, creates wind resistance or encounters wind resistance. And my view of the meaning of the word shadow, or the idea of selecting the word shadow, as it typifies the ideal characteristic for high speed, which is low profile. And low profile, of course, you realize that a shadow being only two-dimensional, it has no possibility of wind resistance.
No height.
No height, yes, so it has width and length, but no height. So I say the shadow, the word shadow typifies the concept of a high-speed, low wind resistant, or no wind resistant object.
A device basically with no frontal area.
Yeah.
So George had the interesting duty to drive the thing for his first race in 1970.
Well, it was quite an experience, obviously, because it was so radical. And just to continue on what they're talking about with wind resistance, it was a rocket ship on the straightaway. I mean, it was just amazing. We didn't have a real good first-class engine. It was a good engine, but it wasn't a great engine. But it ran well. And the frontal area of the car, I mean, we made it all our time. Now, we qualified midfield in a Can-Am field with that car the first race out, which I have to admit surprised me because I didn't think I was going that fast. But went back to look at the speeds down the straightaway, and I was going that fast. And then I got scared. Because the biggest wind resistance in that car was the driver's sitting up in the middle of it. I mean, there was really very little around. It was a very stiff, strong chassis, though. I mean, Trevor did a fantastic job. It was you jacked it up, and it stayed jacked up. It didn't do all this twisting that a lot of the later cars did. It was well thought out. It just, as Trevor alluded to, there was a lot of shortcomings that, and I like how to phrase it. It was ahead of its time. He was on the right path. Don and Trevor were on the right path. The car had what it needed to be, something better. It just was a little ahead of some of the mechanical things that needed to cooperate with a car that small. And if you did that car today, I'm sure it would be a little different car, but it'd probably be a lot better car because a lot of the products are now that small and would fit into the configuration of the little wheels. So it was a challenge to drive. It didn't like bumps at all. But it was, the track was smooth, like it was on the straightaway, with the low rate resistance. It was very quick. But we didn't have a lot of success. We had a considerable difficulty overheating. Might remember, if any of you looked at some of the pictures of it through its stages, we never raced the same car the next race. We had always on making changes. Some were good and some weren't allowed, so, but we had trouble cooling the car. So it was, there were a lot of things that could have and would have been worked out if we had more time and maybe a little later in racing where products were better. So
I'd like to point out in the picture, the original car without a wing had an extended tail, and the two radiators were behind the rear wheels. Trevor may tell us more about why that turned out not to be successful, but in order to run the car at Motorsports with a high wing, you can see what looks like a big flap at the back of the wing. That's actually the radiator core mounted on top of the wing.
The original car, as Pete just said, had the radiators behind the rear wheels with side scoops to grab the air. Hopefully there was, we hoped going to go through the radiators. George, being an extremely fast driver in anything that he drives, the quicker he went with the car, the more of a tendency we had when running the car close to either side of the track, there was a tendency to hook the side scoops on the car because the car had a certain width in the front, but the width in the back was a good 14 inches wider than in the front. So George would, there was a tendency to catch things on the side of the track and the scoops. It was very difficult to keep the scoops on the car, and even when they were there, temperatures tended to soar. We had serious cooling problems with the car. So anyway, there came a point where I decided that the side scoops on the back of the car and everything else about the cooling system didn't work properly. And plus we needed more downforce at the back of the car. Early development showed us that we had a car that had about pretty close to 70% of its weight on the back end of the car. And aerodynamically, for aerodynamic balance, you need an aerodynamic force distribution, downforce in this case, hopefully, that would be roughly in a 70-30 proportion. Well, it was nowhere near that in the original configuration. And no amount of spoilering at the back of the car could really get the balance right. And the point at which we got the balance right was a point where I put a wing on the back of the car, and we could get the aerodynamic balance right, and then the radiators, which weren't effective where they originally were, I thought, well, we should, with the wing needed a spoiler on the back, and so instead of having a conventional spoiler, which the original test wing had, I substituted radiators for the spoiler. And the system, until it got overheated, it really worked great. The radiators were extremely small until it overheated. That's the key term. So it was at least more effective than the original system, and more compact. The whole rear end of the car was now removed behind the back of the rear wheels. The car, in the process of putting the wing on it and the radiators on the wing, the drag was increasing as time went on, but our speed kept increasing. And anyway, that's the direction the car had moved in at the point where we made our first race. And that picture behind you was taken at Motorsports, I'm sure. Right?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. Anyway, the car was under development at all times. And so Motorsport was just one of those development points.
There's another point that I wanted to mention about George having to fit into that car. You notice how low it is. The whole idea was low profile, so I won't ask George to demonstrate this, but each of you sitting in your chair, imagine putting both of your feet into a footwell that is not as high as your shoes. You're going to have to operate the pedals by pivoting your toes out as far as they can go. Right foot on the gas. And George and I were talking about the left foot. George doesn't remember being able to use his left foot on the brake for some reason. But in any case, there also was no room for a clutch pedal, which is okay when you're out on the track running a Hewland gearbox. You can shift it without the gear, but you still have to get out of the clutch, out of the pits. And so the car had a hand clutch. And in my book, Can-Am, I have a picture of George sitting in the car ready to go, and he's got one hand on the steering wheel, one hand on the gear shift, and one hand on the... Okay, wait. It was complex. Dennis Losher, who was here, has restored one of the Shadow cars and ran it for a while. But Dennis, you had the brains to set the pedals up right so that you could... oh, you did not do that? Okay.
Well, look, I did that, but I...
Ah.
The way,
Okay.
I left on the way, no George Road.
Okay. Keep keep it, if you don't mind. This is a good chance to ask someone who's actually driven one of these as well. Dennis, you were
You mean
telling
there's
me...
more than one guy that drives that?
Dennis has told me that having to restore the car, tell us what you told me about your insights into the decisions that Trevor had to make to solve problems that no one had ever solved on this car.
Trevor had to package everything into a small box. And we designed it from the tires inward. And so everything from the brake rotors, the brake calipers, I don't know if people know, he took Hurst Earhart aluminum Trans Am brake calipers and he sectioned them. He cut them and welded them back together to fit a small 8-inch rotor in the front of those 10-inch wheels. Can you imagine today taking a brake caliper and cutting it apart, welding it back together, and then go tell George, go drive it, race your car.
We assured George everything was well done.
They didn't let me around the car very much.
One thing I'd like to point out, George was one of our first drivers, and George later on came along in Formula One. I'd like to comment that George's fame as a fast driver was borne out in the fact that he is the only Grand Prix driver who ever scored championship points in his first 2 races.
He had never driven a Formula One car before. He had never been to Kailami in South Africa, 1973. He finished 6th, which was the last points-paying position in those days. The following race, he raced in the city streets of Barcelona, Spain, and ended up 3rd in the shadow. And that was my first year covering Formula One, and I thought, wow, these guys are onto something.
My favorite picture is George in his second race leading Jackie Eakes, who's multiple Grand Prix and International Championship holder. And he maintained that position through almost the end of the race and had to stop for fuel.
We had a good race.
That's all. Leading Eakes in the Ferrari is a lifetime championship dream.
I want to remind Don who remembers Enzo was there that weekend. And when the shadows were rolled out of the carrier, it wasn't very long that the Commodore was around. And taking in everything about the shadow, because the shadow was different. And Tony Southgate had done a nice job with the car, and aesthetically it was gorgeous. It had some shortcomings, but they always do. But we worked with it, and by the end of the year, it was a pretty good race car. But Enzo was, after we kind of embarrassed him, he was not happy.
Did he proposition you to a driver?
No, he had Jackie Hicks, and there's certainly nothing wrong with Jackie Hicks. He's a great guy. Actually, because of that race, Jackie and I became real good friends, off and on the track, because we had a lot of respect for one another. We raced each other, I don't know, it was probably 20-some laps like that, nose to tail, back and forth, and never touched each other, never did anything rude or crude, just raced. And because of that, we both had a lot of admiration for each other and became good friends.
About Jackie Hicks, incidentally, he visited Trevor's shop in Costa Mesa. I think it was 1968. And Trevor had some models that we wanted him to look at. And he recommended that we enter Grand Prix racing. And interestingly enough, in 1976 or 7, Shadow, there was a Can-Am race, full international open class race in which Jackie Ickes in the Porsche, and I don't know which model, but it was the one that he was holding world championship standing in, the shadow car, which, as he had prophesied, would be successful. And we beat Jackie Ickes in the factory Porsche, I think the 972.
You know, I have to make a comment about George.
Not Trevor. Don't start anything.
I have a lot of comments about George, but most of them are extremely positive. This guy, we put him in what I think is probably one of the most difficult cars to just start driving from scratch ever done. And he, by my recollection, or maybe he'll tell it differently, but I have no recollection of him ever really getting in trouble with that car. We did a lot of testing. We did thousands of miles of testing, Laguna Seca, Riverside. He never got it really unhorsed. I can't recall you ever going off track with the car. And he had a lot of reasons to get in trouble with that car. I mean, if you missed a shift, as has been mentioned, if you missed a shift, you could get sort of caught out, as it were, and have a hard time getting back into gear. And doing that and worrying about all the other things and the position of every organ he had in the body was in a slightly odd position. It had to be difficult. So I must say, as a test driver, and I worked with George before with his Lola T70, of course, in development of it, but as a test driver, George was phenomenal. And as a guy that could go quick and keep out of trouble, that's the other thing, George, and I think over the years we saw that in a lot of other forms of racing. He won the 1972 Can-Am in a Porsche that Mark Donahue had gotten in a serious accident, and as I recall, Roger called you, and you stepped in out of nowhere with, I believe, no experience in that car, and went unbelievably quick from the very beginning and won the Can-Am championship that year. I can think of few drivers that could have pulled that one off, if any, in George's history. Full of just amazing driving jobs, but I knew at a very early date, just I had a huge appreciation for George, and I don't think I've ever thanked him for doing as good a job as he did. I mean, we gave him a car that was at best a very difficult car to drive, and it didn't appear difficult, just looking, you know, watching him operate with it and watching him scream at me after he got out of the car. But anyway, he did such a good job with it, and I appreciate that a lot.
I wanted to mention, that we have some other shadow folks in the audience here. We have a couple of, I've recognized a couple of former team members. Gene Lentz is here, Billy Woolridge is here. Anyone else that I haven't mentioned was a member of the original team? And we have a man who doesn't want to talk in public, but you're going to do it, Fred. Fred Sisko also is a shadow owner, sitting next to Dennis. Fred and Dennis have the two Can-Am cars that are parked outside. Fred's is the later version, the Mark III, the 1972 car. And Fred, you allowed me to drive that car here at this racetrack once. I don't know what you had go wrong that day, but you let me do it, and thank you. But tell us about, if both of you chime in, and tell us what the shadow mark and legacy means to you.
Wow. Well, the deal with Pete was that he was out there taking pictures. We were at this track right here. It was a cold day. And he looked like somebody that was dying to get in the car. So we got some pillows and stuck him in the car so he could drive it. And I was hoping he'd get out the first gear, which he did. And when he pulled it in, he had a smile on his face that, fine. I have to tell you, prior to that car, I was driving an F1 car, and when I got into the shadow and went my first 3 laps, I said, what did I do? Because the F1 was like a go-kart, nothing to it. I got into this Mark III, and it immediately told me who was in charge. And, the only thing I could see on the car was the shadow. I'm sorry, this one was broken.
I met Don in 1984 when I went down to his shop with my son Ron to look at an F1 car. And then I looked up in his cubicle on the top rung. There was this black thing sticking out. And I said, "What is that?" He said, "Hop onto this forklift and we'll go up." That was my first experience with this. So we went up 3 flights up to it, and I looked at the car. I said, "I need to figure out how to own that car." And I got that car at 85, and then 4 hours to get to work on it. I got hooked real quick. I'll tell you what, I think I'm on my 5th shadow now. I got the blessing from my wife in the morning. "Okay, go ahead and buy that F1 car." Yes. I did ask her, "Could you put that in writing, please?" So, what the shadow did for me is that I've met so many people that I've become, on my side, extremely friendly with, and I've known them, and it's strictly the shadow. And I met George, who looked at me funny when I bought one of those small wheel ones at an auction. And I asked him, "How did you drive that?" Because we don't want to get into that.
I just want to know how many sugars he'd had before he bought it.
And Trevor was good enough to come out and look at that one. We're in the process through Virtuoso to put that car together as close as we can to what it was. I don't want to, I've always been proud to be able to tell Don I've never taken these cars beyond safety. And there's no turbo, there's none of that stuff on it. I always wanted to keep them as is and drive accordingly. I have to tell you that something happened with the car yesterday. It told me I was 40 years old or something. Something happened. I'm honking on with that little baby and looking forward to the day. I have the small wheel car. Let's see, small wheel car, the DN4, my baby, the Mark III, which I have 5 logbooks that are full. So I guess, like Don said, I've driven it more than anybody. And then a DN9, F1, and I have now another F1. I don't know what's next.
It's a DN3.
Yeah, DN3. If there's something else that comes along, I'll try my wife again. And my deal is that someday I'm going to park them in my garage, go say hello to them every day. Once a week I'll fire them up and I'll talk to them. And then Shadow. How can you not like the name Shadow? That's so cool. They're black. Well, wait a minute, the DN9 started blue. I want to ask somebody about that. It must have had something to do with UOP or something. Anyway, enough. I'm hoping that we can recruit Trevor to visit us once in a while to make sure we're going the right direction with our small wheel car. And I'm hoping to have that together this time next year. And yes, I want it out there on the track. So yeah, I'm sure I can't get George to drive it, but we'll try. All right, that's it.
Is there anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question of these guys?
On the original car, the theory was, you know, to get it as low as possible for aerodynamic, which is a sound theory. It's what I use in my go-kart racing. I have a road race go-kart here, and I have a sit-up. I have a sit-up and a lay-down, and the lay-down with the exact same identical motor at 10 miles an hour faster. Did you ever consider at any time, say, using a flat 12 air-cooled motor to get rid of the deficiencies that the car had because of the big motor and not being able to keep it cool?
Well, in the beginning, I considered a lot of things. Of course, the Corvair engine was a very lightweight engine, and you could turbocharge it and make reasonable horsepower out of it. And there were a lot of other engines available, but I got to admit, from the standpoint of horsepower to cost ratio, the Chevrolet, the ubiquitous Chevrolet engine is hard to beat. It was readily available, everybody understood it. I didn't have any easy access to Porsche engines or the like. So we considered, you know, you look at taking a clean sheet of paper project, You could theorize that, yes, a flat 12 making, X horsepower might have been a great approach for that car, but there wasn't time or money to even explore anything like that.
Don, is it appropriate to talk about the potential of a Japanese engine for Le Mans in that car? Or is it okay to speak about that?
You're talking about the Lehigh car.
The Lehigh car, yes.
Yes.
Okay, tell them what engine that you thought might
You
work.
seem to know more about
You have told me things in confidence, and I'm giving you a chance to tell the audience the same thing, or I never said a word about it.
Well, hello. I had had a lot of experience in Japan, and so I was acquainted with Japanese engine possibilities. So we did ask Toyota for their new, they were, I think, starting to be interested in Grand Prix racing. So we did ask for one of their special experimental engines, and it was fitted into one of these cars that we ran at Riverside for so-called, we couldn't get AAA to certify us for a speed record. The main straightaway at Riverside is a mile long. So we had a kind of an idea for publicity stunt to do a timed mile run for high speed. And so we had one car, the car with the question mark. The question mark? Oh, no,
It's
it's
a dollar sign, actually.
dollar sign.
Yes, we're going to ask you about the dollar sign as well.
And the dollar sign was indicative of what we didn't have.
90, I remember. So that was fitted into one of those cars for a testing drive. And we actually were able to persuade the Japanese consulate, since AAA wouldn't time it. We had the Japanese consular official come out and certify our so-called dollar sign car speed record.
And that had that Toyota engine
Yes,
in it
it
at the time? Right.
Yeah, we still have the engine, it's not in the car right now.
You still have the engine?
It may go back in. We're thinking, we're restoring some of the old cars, and that's a prospect for a new
That
restoration.
would be cool. Then you can take it to Le Mans for one of their historic days there.
It's a little out of date for that, I think.
Right.
Nothing has ever appeared in print or pictures anywhere of the Toyota V8 powered Shadow.
How fast did it go?
The engine did not perform properly for the test that we set up. So unfortunately, it was a very early point of development of the car, and what goes fast must stop also. So Riverside presents a problem in that, yes, it does have a mile straightaway, but it also has a turn that follows the end of the straightaway. Anyway, minor functional issues. Anyway, it was not a good test, but it was not a good test for kind of the wrong reasons. The engine really wasn't running properly for that test.
Let's talk a little bit about the further development of the Can-Am cars leading to the 1974 car, which George has often said was a wonderful car to drive. George came back to the team that year in '74 and partnered Jackie Oliver, and there was a relationship between George and Jackie. Jackie happened to win the first 4 races of the season, and then in the 5th season, the 5th race of the year was the final one. The series ended abruptly in mid-pack, but Shadow won the championship there, having won the first 4 races. Don, I asked you once about how you feel about the machines you created, and you said to me that your overriding pride comes from your legacy of creating beautiful machinery that performed well. Can you talk to us about that? What shadow means to you, having done it for 10 years?
I haven't thought much about motivation. I think it's kind of automatic. Most people in racing have a desire to drive fast cars for whatever reason they do that. But my motivation in meeting Trevor was the fact that you could actually create the car and make it aesthetically pleasing and innovative and exciting, and at the same time have it being successful in competition. And I think I was fortunate in being able to put that combination together, and it was vastly satisfying.
Go ahead in the back.
Yeah, I have a question about the tires now, the very small tires.
Yes.
Is Firestone still supporting these very few tires required for this car?
It's strange you asked that question because I've always felt flattered by the fact that Harm Lagai, who is for many years was the chief designer of Porsche automobiles, I don't know what their proper name is, but he was Porsche's chief designer, and he was actively racing in vintage racing. He used to come to Park Lake almost every year in various kinds of cars. But when he decided to start his own personal team of competition cars, he decided to use a shadow. And he bought one of the initial shadows that Trevor designed. And and I guess my final feeling of pride is caused by the fact that when we did our scrapbook, Harm Lagai signed the dedication page and still owns a shadow car. And I thought it was kind of a special compliment, the fact that he is the head of a company that is outstanding, perhaps one of the most outstanding competition car teams in the world, chose a shadow as his personal toy to race in competition.
Relative to that question about Firestone supporting tire development or continuation for that car, Harm raced that car at Goodwood 2 years ago. I don't know if he did last year, but it was not supported by Firestone reappearing with that tire. He had a big problem with tires on his car, and it has had that problem to this day. He uses Avon tires on one end of the car, and on the other end of the car he uses American Hoosier tires, I believe. And they're not on the same wheel size as the original car. The wheels were 10-inch in the front and 12-inch in the back, and I think they're different sizes today. And the way the car runs, or the way I saw it run, like at least a year ago, I saw pictures of the way it ran at Goodwood. The tires that he can get today are not as small as the original tires. So unfortunately, the car does not sit right on the ground. It's too high at the back, it's a little too high at the front, but at least he's got tires that he can run the European old car series with.
Other people in the audience, what would you like to know?
Trevor, you designed the Mark I to be an aerodynamically great car in '68, and you conceived it in '69 when you developed it. And so you had movable aerodynamic devices allowed, so you had a big air dam that was going to come up in the back. You had elephant ears that came out that grabbed the air on the sides that George would knock off in the corners. And you had air dams that came up in front of the tires. Those are the slots that are in front of the front tires. Correct. At the end of '69, you knew the rules had changed, and for '70, you couldn't have anything moving. Why didn't you stop and say, that's it, we're not gonna go forward?
Well, the catch is, we had too much time and energy invested in the project up to that point. And I'll say, yeah, any movable aerodynamic devices were disallowed from all major racing series as a result of a lot of accidents. And so it was a reasonable decision, but it had a huge effect on development of our car, because I was very well aware in the very beginning that the car, we were to have low drag, immense top speed. We had very small brakes on the car, very small hydraulic mechanical brakes. But one of the important ingredients in the whole concept was air brakes for high-speed braking. And the air brakes were disallowed. But in fact, we never completed the construction of the air brakes because of the disallowance of them. But that's unfortunate. Yet you have a project that you started, and we had so much time and money and personnel investment in it. I figured, well, we'll have to make do with what we've got here. We couldn't just stop the project. There was too much invested in it. We figured, of course, that we could overcome anything. I mean, it's another issue connected with automobile designers, especially me at that time. I knew that we could overcome anything. So take away our aerodynamics, sure, we'll fix it. Somehow or another we'll overcome these things. Well, of course, that was extremely difficult to do, and anybody that sees the front brakes on that car will wonder what mind could possibly have conceived or pushed that sort of a development. But I do have one brief comment about designing. Retrospective design is sometimes an easy thing to do, and in looking back at that car, there were a lot of interesting pluses to the car. There were a lot of interesting minuses, very legitimate technical minuses on that car. And probably the biggest minus at this point in time, if I'm criticizing it from a handling point of view, something that should be changed by any future owner of that car. Nobody should, if you're a designer or thinking about designing a race car, don't ever design one that uses friction shock absorbers. That car was the fastest friction shock car known to man ever, but there's no reason to be the designer, in my opinion, of the fastest friction shock car in the world, because they don't work well at all. And George commented about the car not really being too good over bumps. It really wasn't, and just how bad it was, I didn't know until we ran a Motorsport. And Motorsport has its smooth areas and it's got bumpy areas, but unfortunately I was sort of under the car all the time at Motorsport and didn't have a chance to go out and look at the car around corners. But after the race, some people came and talked to me about what they saw the car doing, and apparently you could see air under the tires entirely too much. And we all know from a theoretical point of view that adhesion is definitely gone at the point that the tire is off the ground. So how George, even after that, how this guy actually maintained total control of that car, because as I mentioned before, he really did a phenomenal job of developing it, but to my knowledge, and you can correct me on this, I don't think he ever spun it, and I have no idea why.
I was scared too. Well, I had my pilot's license, so I qualified for flying.
Amazing.
Now, and I made reference to some of the engineering things that have come up through the years. I mean, we're talking, 30-some, 40 years ago. There's a lot of improvements in shock absorbers and the size of shock absorbers. We were just ahead of the curve so far that we couldn't catch the curve to make it right. So those friction shocks, I even think Henry Ford got rid of them.
Henry Ford did get rid of those, and everybody else but me got rid of them. And I got to admit, we thought in the beginning, in running the car and developing it, they seemed workable. But the faster we went, the more I had to increase the compression of the friction shock so they could take care of the energy that we were putting into them. And the bottom line of friction shock absorbers is that they work okay as long as you're not depending on them developing any friction. As soon as you start cranking up the pressure between the discs of a friction shock, then they experience what's called stick slip, where a certain amount of force, it requires a lot of force to get them to move. And before they move, you ain't got no shock absorbers. And that's where that car, over small bumps and whatnot, must have been awful. Because the other horrible development problem that was experienced by Firestone was the tire pressures had to, when we first ran the car, to get the tires to come up flat on the ground required over 60 psi of inflation pressure. So all of our early car development was done with 60 pounds of inflation pressure or greater in the tires. And even when we got to the point where we could race the car, it was a problem for Firestone. And they never felt they got the tires right. They always had to run compounds that were about 3 steps behind the normal tires of the day because they ran too hot. And then the carcass shape, they could never get the curvature right, so we had to run more tire pressure than was normally the case. So that's the curse of development. And if you're a designer and you're going to go as far out on a limb as I did at that time, you've got to be ready to live with problems that you can't even overcome in some cases. But anyway, the shock absorbers, from my point of view, were the worst. That was the worst invention I made on that car, and the car, even at this point in time, would be a far better car with some kind of hydraulic shock on it. Properly done, even a small one, even a dinky one, I could have done it on that car. I really have lots of regrets about the early development, but that's the advantage of getting older.
You and Fred can have a discussion after the session here.
I should have talked to you a long time.
Well, it's always hindsight, it's 2020.
Okay, it's fine.
2020 hindsight is just phenomenal.
How many shadow cars were ultimately produced?
The question is, how many shadow cars in total were there?
Just over 100.
Just over 100. That includes all the Formula One, all the Formula 5000, all the Can-Ams and so on.
I have a question here.
Yeah, this question is for Trevor. Could you elaborate a little bit more on how the 101 car, in your opinion, is superior to other cars and some of the things that you did that were different than the other cars at the time?
When you say 101 car,
I'm just using that as...
I'm not the designer of the 101 car. I was the designer of only the first, the small one, which I regard as being an unsuccessful race car, basically. I mean, from the point of view of success, it was definitely not a successful car. But all the shadows that came after me, the designer that succeeded me was Peter Bryant. And then Peter Bryant was followed by Tony Southgate. That's the way it was.
Okay. Maybe Don, you could answer that question regarding the success of the 101 car and some of the advances compared to the other cars at the time.
Well, I guess the fact of winning the Can-Am Championship in the 101 car was something of an expression of, that was the DN4, and it was certainly, well, it was beaten by the Porsche in one race. And, but it won all the other races, so hard to say anything more.
I had an opportunity to drive the first Shadow and the last Shadow. And the DN4 was an awesome race car. Don doesn't allow it, but I think I had 4 track records for that car in '74. And I broke the records that Mark had set with the 30. So that was a quick race car. Normally aspirated.
How much horsepower?
probably 7 something. It was an interesting plane, big block. A lot of times there were 494s. We did a couple races, we had 510, and it had more grunt, but it wasn't a lot. But every little bit helps when you're on the edge. It just was it's a car that put the weight of the power into the ground. It stuck, had good aerodynamics. It stopped. It just was a good, friendly race car. And have a lot of things to scare you once in a while. I mean, it was quick, but it was always, you felt under control with it. So.
George, that year was the first year under a fuel quantity restriction. Did the engine get detuned for better mileage?
I don't think we detuned them very much. Do you, Don? No. Lee Murrow was building our motors in London.
Right.
Yeah, well, he's just since passed away, by the way. He was an engine builder for McLaren for many years in the early 70s. Obviously a talented engine guy, so no, we didn't detune them, we just poured more gas in them. Well, the shorter races, it didn't become critical because I think the car original concept, we probably had room for more fuel because originally we used to run 200 miles on the T70s in the early 70s. We started with 70 and 80 gallons of fuel. We were rolling bomb. And we didn't, the fuel, the ladders were not what they are today. A lot of things were different. But the early Can-Am cars, when we had 70 gallons in them, they changed a lot because you know how much 70 gallons of fuel weighs. So once it was got down to halfway or empty, the car was a totally different car.
Yeah, that was more than you had in your Piper Arrow.
Yeah, it's more than I can afford to.
Go ahead.
Who were supplying the blocks then besides Reynolds?
Who was supplying the blocks then besides Reynolds?
The aluminum blocks, yeah.
I don't think Donovan.
I think they were the only.
I think
They were the only.
I think he was the only one.
Right.
I think Reynolds did all the 510s.
Yep. And were they linerless?
The Reynolds block engines did not have steel liners,
Right.
correct?
Right.
That was done in development for the Vega engine, which is renowned for its success.
I have a quick comment about George's breaking track records with the 101 car and the records that Mark Donohue may have set. But the Porsches, I believe the Porsche that had the record before you broke it, I think those cars had something upwards of 1,200 horsepower or maybe more.
Yeah,
Comment on that? It was a huge amount of horsepower those cars had.
George may be able to tell us the real story now. Roger's not here.
I was sworn to secrets. Once the captain swears you in, you got to stick to it. Now, we did have a lot of, in 72, we pretty much ran with a more limited boost. In 73, it was getting more competitive and we were putting driver control knobs in the cockpit. So if you needed to get around somebody, you just turned the knob and you got another 200 horsepower. Let me tell you, you can tell 200 horsepower.
It turns out we do have a representative from Roger Penske here. And Ms. Stropis has just pointed out that we now will shortly have a photo opportunity outside and also, a chance to do a bathroom break, and then we'll come back in here and do some signing of things. So,
Yes,
Ms. Penske, would you tell us what we're doing next?
Mr. Nelko, as I was once called. All the panelists and Fred and Dennis with the shadows outside posing for a photo op for everyone. We'll do it right now. Meanwhile, thank you very much for being here. The panel was terrific.